January 18th, 1886. Dakota Territory. The thermometer outside Millbrook's general store read 30 degrees below zero, and it was still falling. Inside, thin-walled log cabins across the settlement, families huddled around roaring fires, burning through their winter wood supply at an alarming rate. Frost crept across interior walls. Water buckets froze solid despite sitting 3 feet from the hearth. But in one dwelling, half buried in the prairie earth with a massive stone roof, a single man sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, his small fire barely more than embers. They had called him insane, a fool wasting months on a grave with a roof. Even the settlement's most experienced builders had warned him, "You'll freeze in that damp hole, where the roof will crush you in your sleep." Tonight would prove who understood the true science of survival. What did this immigrant stonemason grasp about thermal mass and earth-shelter design that the so-called experts completely missed? Before we reveal how his primitive shelter outperformed every modern cabin in the territory, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I promise you'll learn survival techniques tonight that could save your life in a real winter crisis. And if you make it to the end, I'll show you the exact measurements that made this design nearly indestructible. Now let's go back to where this story really begins. Spring 1885. Millbrook Settlement, Dakota Territory. When Jacob Reinhardt arrived in Millbrook with nothing but a stonemason's tools and a weathered journal filled with sketches, the other settlers thought he'd fit right in. The territory needed skilled builders. Log cabins were going up fast, and everyone assumed this stocky German immigrant would simply join the construction crews. Instead, Jacob purchased a small plot on the eastern edge of the settlement. Not the prime bottomland near the creek, but a slight rise with southern exposure, and immediately began digging. Not a foundation for a cabin. He was digging the cabin itself. He's burying himself alive. Margaret Hensley told her husband after watching Jacob spend his 3rd consecutive day excavating. That man's going to dig his own grave and call a home. The design made no sense to anyone watching. Jacob carved into the hillside, creating a rectangular pit roughly 14 feet wide and 20 feet long, descending 6 feet below ground level. The rear wall pressed directly into the earth. The side walls were partially excavated, partially built up with carefully selected stones. Limestone and sandstone he hauled from a quarry 15 miles south. But the feature that drew the most ridicule was his roof plan. While his neighbors debated whether to use sod or split shingles for their conventional peaked roofs, Jacob was constructing something else entirely, a massive stone vault. He built wooden centering, temporary support framework, and began laying stones in an arch pattern, each one carefully shaped and positioned. The arch spanned the entire 14-foot width, creating a barrel vault that would ultimately support thousands of pounds of stone and earth. "The weight will collapse at the moment you remove those supports," predicted Samuel Cartwright, who'd built 17 cabins in 3 territories. "I've seen men try stone roofs before. Always ends the same way, crushed timbers and wasted effort." Jacob simply smiled, his hands never stopping their work. "In the Falls, my grandfather built root cellars that stood for 200 years, he replied in thickly accented English. Stone remembers how to hold itself. He laid each stone with lime mortar, checking angles with tools he'd forged himself. The arch rose gradually, curving overhead like the ceiling of a cathedral, until it reached its apex, a full 8 feet above the excavated floor level. When complete, the stone roof was 18 inches thick at the crown, widening to 24 inches where it met the walls. Then came the part that made even the skeptics fall silent. Jacob piled earth on top of the stone vault. Not a thin layer, but a full 2 feet of dense prairie soil, carefully graded to shed water away from the structure. The final effect was bizarre to frontier eyes. A gentle mound rising from the hillside, barely distinguishable from the surrounding prairie, with only a southern-facing entrance and a small chimney pipe betraying human construction. "It's an abomination," pronounced Reverend Whitmore at Sunday service. "God meant for men to live above ground, not burrow like animals." But Jacob Reinhardt wasn't burrowing. He was engineering. The criticism intensified as summer turned to fall. Samuel Cartwright made it his personal mission to warn Jacob of impending disaster. "I've built in Montana, Wyoming, and now here," he declared at the settlement meeting in August. "I know frontier construction. That dugout will be a frozen coffin come January." He enumerated the problems with the confidence of experience. "First, you're sleeping below ground level. Cold sinks. You'll be living in a frost pocket while the rest of us have our heat rising properly. Second, moisture. Earth is damp. Those stone walls will weep water all winter. You'll wake up with ice on your blankets. Third, that roof. I'll grant it hasn't collapsed yet, but winter snow will add another 2 tons of weight. The freeze-thaw cycle will crack that mortar, and come spring, the whole thing comes down." Other voices joined the chorus. Martha Pritchard, whose husband had died of pneumonia the previous winter, was particularly insistent. "My John caught his death in a poorly ventilated cabin," she told Jacob. "Your buried hole won't even have proper airflow. You're building a death trap." Even those who meant well couldn't understand his choices. "Why not just build a normal cabin and bank earth around it?" asked Henry Calloway, genuinely puzzled. "Save yourself months of work." Jacob tried to explain. He spoke of thermal mass, the way stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it even more slowly. He described how Earth maintains a stable temperature year-round, how at depths of just 4 to 6 feet below the surface, the ground temperature holds steady around 50 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of surface conditions. He explained that his barrel vault wasn't fighting gravity. It was channeling force through compression, the way Roman aqueduct had stood for millennia. The settlers nodded politely and understood nothing. "Fancy European ideas," Samuel muttered. "This is Dakota territory. Different rules." By October, Jacob had become a social pariah. Other settlers stopped inviting him to barn raisings. Children were warned away from the crazy German's dirt house. We came to town for supplies. Conversation stopped, but he continued working. He installed a small iron stove, not in the center of the space, but in the northeast corner, carefully positioned. He built a stone chimney that rose through the earthen roof, with multiple baffles to extract maximum heat before exhaust escaped. He constructed wooden sleeping platforms 18 inches above the floor level. He carved ventilation channels that allowed fresh air to enter low and exit high, creating gentle circulation without drafts. The interior, when finished, defied expectations. The stone walls were smooth, almost polished. The barrel-vaulted ceiling created a sense of unexpected spaciousness. Small windows on the southern wall, protected by wooden shutters, let in light without sacrificing thermal integrity. The whole space, though underground, felt neither cramped nor oppressive. "It's actually quite pleasant," admitted Margaret Hensley after Jacob invited her inside to settle a debt. "But pleasant in October means nothing. Winter will tell the truth." Jacob lit his first fire in early November. A modest blaze, nothing like the roaring infernos his neighbors maintained. He burned perhaps 6 small logs over the course of an entire day. "He'll learn," Samuel predicted confidently. "First time the temperature drops below 0, he'll be burning everything he's got just to stay alive, assuming the moisture doesn't kill him first." The settlement waited for Jacob's experiment to fail. Some waited with concern, others with barely concealed satisfaction. None of them understood what he'd actually built. What Jacob Reinhardt had constructed wasn't primitive at all. It was sophisticated engineering disguised as simplicity. The key lay in understanding heat not as something that disappears, but as something that moves. In a conventional log cabin, heat from a fire moves in 3 ways: through conduction, direct contact with surfaces, convection, air circulation, and radiation, invisible waves traveling through air. The problem with wood frame construction is that all 3 pathways lead directly to heat loss. Gaps between logs leak air constantly. Thin walls conduct heat outward rapidly. Heat rises to empty attic spaces and dissipates. A roaring fire feels warm when you're sitting next to it, but the moment you step away or the fire dies down, the cabin chills within an hour. Jacob's design attacked these problems systematically. The earth walls, partially excavated, partially built, meant that 75% of the structure's envelope was surrounded by soil, maintaining a stable 50-degree temperature. Even when surface air plunged to 30 below zero, that earth was still 50 degrees. The shelter wasn't fighting an 80-degree temperature differential like surface cabins. It was managing a 30-degree differential, and only on the southern face. The stone vault roof provided massive thermal mass. Approximately 8,000 pounds of limestone and sandstone suspended overhead. Stone has what engineers call high specific heat capacity. It takes tremendous energy to change its temperature, and once warmed, it releases that heat slowly over many hours. Jacob's vault absorbed heat from the fire and from the earth beneath the topsoil layer, then radiated it downward constantly, creating a gentle umbrella of warmth. The 2-foot earth blanket above the stone added another insulation layer and protected the structure from thermal shock, those violent temperature swings that crack conventional roofs and exhaust heating systems. The corner stove placement was equally calculated. By positioning the heat source in the northeast corner rather than the center, Jacob created a thermal gradient. Warm air rose, curved along the barrel vault, and circulated naturally before descending along the cooler southern wall. This passive convection loop meant heat distributed throughout the space without fans or complicated ductwork. The stone walls absorbed excess heat and prevented the space from overheating while the fire burned. The ventilation channels solved the moisture problem that Samuel Cartwright had predicted. Fresh air entered through a low opening on the southern face, warmed as it passed near the stove, picked up moisture from breathing and any cooking, then exited through the chimney and a small upper vent. The constant, gentle air movement prevented condensation without creating drafts. But perhaps the most brilliant element was what Jacob didn't build: wasted height. Conventional cabins often rose 10 to 12 feet to the peak, creating large volumes of air that required constant heating. Jacob's space peaked at 8 feet, enough for comfortable standing, minimizing the volume that needed warming. Every cubic foot of heated air represented fuel cost. Jacob eliminated unnecessary cubic feet. The settler who came closest to understanding was Henry Calloway's teenage son, Daniel, who was studying engineering through correspondence courses. He visited Jacob in mid-November with paper and pencil, sketching the design. "It's like the whole structure is a heat battery," Daniel said, working through the concept aloud. "You charge it slowly with a small fire, and it discharges slowly, so you never have those extremes." "Exactly," Jacob replied. "In my grandfather's village, we heated the stube, the main room, with one firing in the morning and one in the evening. The masonry held warmth all day and through the night. This is the same principle, expanded. But your neighbors think about heating air," Jacob finished. "I heat stone and earth. Air is a terrible thing to heat. It escapes too easily. Stone is patient. Stone remembers." Daniel did calculations. Based on the stone mass, the earth insulation values, and the minimal surface area exposed to outdoor temperatures, he estimated Jacob's shelter would require roughly 1/3 the fuel of a comparable log cabin to maintain similar interior temperatures. "You should show people these numbers," Daniel urged. Jacob shook his head. "They won't believe numbers. They'll believe winter." By December, Jacob's firewood stack was noticeably smaller than his neighbor's. He burned 4 to 6 logs per day, seasoned oak and ash, carefully selected for heat density, while families in conventional cabins burned 15 to 20. "He's rationing because he didn't cut enough," some speculated. "He's freezing in there and too proud to admit it," others insisted. Jacob said nothing. He worked his small forge, carved spare tool handles, read by lamplight in his shirt sleeves while outside. December winds howled across the prairie at 40 miles per hour, driving the temperature down to 5 above zero, then below. Inside his shelter, the temperature held steady at 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The testing ground was coming. Dakota winter doesn't negotiate. It doesn't accept excuses or theories. And in January 1886, it would arrive with biblical fury. January 15th, 1886. The barometer at Millbrook's General Store had been falling for 3 days. Old-timers watched the sky with expressions that made younger settlers nervous. The light took on that peculiar metallic quality that precedes serious cold. Birds disappeared. Even the ever-present prairie wind seemed to draw breath and weight. "Big one coming," announced Clayton Morris, who'd survived 18 Dakota winters. Seen these signs before. Could hit 25, 30 below. Maybe colder. Families responded with practiced urgency. Men split extra firewood. Women stuffed rags into every gap between logs. Children hauled water before the wells froze solid. The settlement's 12 log cabins battened down like ships preparing for a storm. At Jacob's dugout, preparation looked different. He banked earth higher around his southern entrance. He checked the chimney baffles and cleared ash from beneath the stove. He brought in 10 logs. Not the 30 or 40 his neighbors were stockpiling, but 10 carefully selected pieces of seasoned hardwood. "That'll last you 2 days if you're lucky," Samuel Cartwright observed, driving his wagon past with a load of split pine. His own woodpile held enough fuel for 3 weeks of hard-burning. "It will be sufficient," Jacob replied. The storm arrived on the night of January 17th. It began with snow, thick, heavy flakes that fell vertically in the windless cold. Then the wind came, not gradually, but like a fist, driving temperatures from 15 above zero to 10 below in less than 3 hours. By midnight, the thermometer outside the general store read 22 below zero. By 4 a.m. on January 18th, it touched 30 below, and it stayed there. In the settlement's log cabins, the battle for survival began in earnest. Fireplaces and stoves roared at maximum capacity. Samuel Cartwright stoked his stone fireplace every 2 hours through the night, burning entire logs at once. Despite this, frost formed on the interior walls. The water bucket 6 feet from the hearth developed a skin of ice. By morning, the temperature in the corners of his cabin had dropped to 38 degrees, while directly in front of the fire, it barely reached 55. "Throw on more wood," he shouted to his eldest son. The boy fed 3 logs into the firebox. The temperature rose briefly, then plummeted again as the fire consumed the fuel and heat poured up the chimney and through gaps in the log walls. Across the settlement, the story repeated. The Hensley family burned through a week's worth of firewood in a single night. The Pritchards moved their children's bedrolls to within 4 feet of the stove, so close that blankets began to scorch. The Callaways discovered their northern wall was so cold that moisture from breathing condensed and froze into patterns of ice ferns on the interior logs. The wind screamed. The cold pressed against every wall like a living thing trying to force its way inside. Inside Jacob Reinhardt's earth-sheltered dwelling, a different reality prevailed. He woke naturally at his usual hour, 6 a.m. The interior temperature, by the simple mercury thermometer hanging from his ceiling beam, read 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The small fire he'd built before sleep had burned down to coals. He added 2 logs, not in panic, not in desperation, but with the calm confidence of someone following a proven routine. The stone walls were dry, slightly warm to the touch. The barrel-vaulted ceiling radiated gentle heat downward. The air was fresh but still, no drafts, no icy fingers reaching through gaps. Jacob dressed in normal indoor clothing, wool trousers, a cotton shirt, knit vest. No heavy coat needed. No shivering huddle near the stove. He prepared coffee. He ate breakfast. He sat in the wooden chair he'd crafted, reading from a Bible he'd carried from Germany, his stocking feet comfortable on the floor that never froze because it was ultimately connected to earth that stayed at 50 degrees no matter what happened on the surface. Outside, the killing cold continued. By midday January 18th, Clayton Morris would later record that his thermometer bottomed out at 34 degrees below zero. Livestock in poorly constructed barns died. Trees cracked with sounds like gunshots as sap froze and expanded. The settlement fell silent except for the wind and the desperate chopping of wood as families realized their stockpiles wouldn't last. But before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying this story, take 2 seconds and hit that like button. And drop a comment telling me, what's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced? Stay to the end, because I'm going to reveal the exact measurements that made this shelter nearly indestructible in conditions that would kill you in a conventional cabin. The test of Jacob's design wasn't just surviving. It was surviving comfortably, efficiently, and proving that centuries-old wisdom still outperformed modern arrogance. And by the evening of January 19th, the settlement would know the truth. January 19th, 1886. 9 a.m. Samuel Cartwright stood at Jacob Reinhardt's entrance, exhausted and desperate. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, feeding his fireplace in a losing battle against the cold. His hands were blistered from splitting frozen wood. His eyes were red-rimmed from smoke. His family had burned through their entire 2-week supply of firewood in less than 48 hours. "I need to borrow some wood," Samuel said, the words costing him everything. "I'll pay you back double come spring." Jacob opened the door fully, and Samuel Cartwright experienced something that would change his understanding of shelter forever. Warm air, genuinely warm air, rolled out from the underground space. Not the scorching blast from an overfired stove, but the gentle, even warmth of a properly heated room. Behind Jacob, visible in the lamplight, the interior looked comfortable, lived in, normal, as if there wasn't a historic cold snap trying to kill everything on the surface. "Come inside," Jacob said simply. "Bring your family." Samuel stepped down into the dugout and stopped, staring. The mercury thermometer hanging from the central beam read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68. His own cabin, despite burning wood at 4 times the rate, was struggling to maintain 48 degrees. The stone walls were completely dry. No frost. No condensation, no ice. The air was fresh, with no trace of the choking smoke that filled every conventional cabin in the settlement. The small iron stove in the corner held a modest fire, nothing remotely resembling the roaring infernos Samuel had been maintaining. "How?" Samuel whispered. "How is this possible?" Jacob gestured to a simple wooden chair. "Sit. I'll explain." Over the next hour, as Samuel thawed and gradually stopped shivering, Jacob walked him through the principles. He placed Samuel's hand on the stone wall, warm, radiating heat accumulated over months. He explained how the 8,000-pound vault overhead was essentially a massive heat battery, charged slowly by the small fire and by the Earth's own stable temperature, discharging its energy at a rate perfectly matched to the space's needs. "Your cabin fights an 80-degree temperature difference," Jacob explained, sketching on a slate. "Outside is 30 below. You're trying to maintain 50 or 60 inside. That's 80 to 90 degrees of difference pushing through every gap, every thin wall. Heat moves from hot to cold. Always. The bigger the difference, the faster it moves." He drew another diagram. "My shelter fights a 30-degree difference at most. The earth around me is 50 degrees. I only need to add 15 to 20 degrees to be comfortable. And stone holds that heat for hours after the fire dies down." "But the wood consumption," Samuel started. "Measure it," Jacob interrupted. He pointed to his wood stack. "I have burned 4 logs per day. Yesterday, during the worst cold, I burned 6. How many did you burn?" Samuel did the mental calculation and felt sick. 32 logs yesterday. Another 14 overnight. 46 logs to achieve worse results than my 6. Jacob's tone held no judgment, only fact. "And your wood is going up the chimney as waste heat because your fireplace has no thermal mass. Hot air rises and escapes. My stove heats stone. Stone heats the space. Even overnight, with no fire, the temperature here never drops below 58 degrees. The implications were staggering. In terms of fuel efficiency, Jacob's design was operating at roughly 700% better performance than conventional construction. But the advantages went beyond mere numbers. You sleep through the night, Samuel realized. You don't wake up every 2 hours to feed the fire. I sleep 8 hours, undisturbed. And your family, Samuel paused. Jacob lived alone. You built this for one person. Could it work for a family? Expand the footprint to 20 by 30 feet. Add a second stove. The same principles apply. Perhaps 8 to 10 logs per day for a family of 6 versus the 60 or 70 you'd burn in a cabin. Samuel Cartwright sat in that comfortable underground space and felt the foundations of his expertise crumbling. He'd built 17 cabins. He'd advised dozens of settlers. He dismissed Jacob's design as the fantasy of an ignorant immigrant. And he'd been completely, embarrassingly wrong. By noon, word had spread. Families began appearing at Jacob's door, not to borrow wood, but to understand. The Hensleys came. The Pritchards. Young Daniel Calloway brought his father and his engineering notes. Even Reverend Whitmore arrived, cold and humbled. Jacob welcomed them all. He showed them the ventilation system, the stove placement, the barrel vault construction. He explained thermal mass using demonstrations, placing their hands on different surfaces, comparing temperatures, illustrating how heat moved and was stored. Margaret Hensley asked the question everyone was thinking. Can you teach us? Can we build these? The cold will break in 3 days, Jacob replied. When it does, I'll help anyone who wants to learn. But understand, this is not quick work. My shelter took 4 months to build properly. Rushing the design defeats the purpose. The gathering became impromptu. Someone brought food. Jacob heated water for coffee on his small stove, which, even with a dozen people in the space, maintained comfortable temperatures without overheating. They sat on his floor, on his sleeping platform, standing along the walls, discussing angles of vaulting and properties of stone and depths of excavation. It was, in effect, the first engineering seminar in Millbrook's short history. By evening, when families reluctantly returned to their cold cabins and the desperate work of maintaining fires through a third night, something had shifted in the settlement. The mockery was gone. The dismissal had evaporated. Jacob Reinhardt was no longer the crazy German digging his own grave. He was the man who understood winter. The cold finally broke on January 22nd. Temperatures climbed to 10 above zero, which felt tropical by comparison. As families emerged to assess damage and count their remaining firewood, the statistics became clear. Jacob Reinhardt's shelter, 24 logs burned over 5 days of extreme cold. Interior temperature never below 58 degrees Fahrenheit, never above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. 0 structural issues. 0 moisture problems. Occupants slept full nights, worked normally, experienced no cold-related stress. Average log cabin in Millbrook, 187 logs burned over the same period. Interior temperatures ranging from 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on proximity to fire. Multiple cases of frostbite. Exhausted families. 2 cabins developed cracked timbers from thermal stress. 1 roof partially collapsed under snow load. The numbers didn't require interpretation. They spoke with mathematical certainty. Spring 1886. Millbrook Settlement. By late March, 7 new earth-sheltered dwellings were under construction in and around Millbrook. Samuel Cartwright, swallowing his pride entirely, became Jacob's first apprentice. Together they designed a family-sized structure for the Pritchards, 22 by 32 feet, with 2 rooms separated by a partial stone wall, capable of housing 6 people comfortably with a daily wood consumption comparable to what a single-family cabin would require. Young Daniel Calloway documented everything. His engineering correspondence course had become a practical education in vernacular architecture. He measured thermal performance, calculated load distributions, and began writing a paper he hoped to publish. Earth-shelter construction in extreme climates. Empirical data from Dakota Territory. The designs evolved. Jacob showed them how to incorporate south-facing windows for passive solar gain in winter, how to orient the structure to prevail winds, how to select stone based on thermal properties, sandstone for high heat retention, limestone for structural strength, how to create proper drainage channels so moisture never accumulated. Some settlers couldn't overcome their psychological resistance to living underground. That was fine. Jacob never pushed. But those who built earth-sheltered homes discovered benefits beyond thermal efficiency. The structures were quiet, profoundly quiet. The earth absorbed sound. Families who'd grown accustomed to hearing every wind gust buffet their cabin walls now slept in silence. Children who'd spent winters with constant low-grade anxiety from the howling cold relaxed. The steady temperatures meant fewer illnesses, better sleep, less stress on everyone's bodies. The designs were also remarkably stormproof. When a tornado touched down 15 miles south in June 1887, it obliterated 2 conventional homesteads. The earth-sheltered homes in its path suffered no damage beyond torn vegetation on their earthen roofs. The occupants, sheltered beneath thousands of pounds of stone and earth, barely felt the storm pass overhead. Word spread beyond Millbrook. Other settlements in Dakota Territory began experimenting with earth-sheltered construction. Some used Jacob's barrel vault design. Others adapted the principle to rectangular beamed roofs with earth covering. The common thread was thermal mass and earth insulation, principles that had been used for millennia but had been forgotten in the rush to adopt modern construction methods. Jacob found himself in demand as a consultant. He traveled to 3 neighboring settlements, teaching, advising, helping troubleshoot designs. He never charged for this knowledge. "My grandfather taught me," he'd say. "I teach you. This is how wisdom survives." In the fall of 1889, a journalist from a Chicago newspaper traveled to Millbrook to document the underground settlement. His article, published that November, was titled "Frontier Wisdom: How Dakota Settlers Rediscovered Ancient Building Techniques." It featured illustrations of Jacob's original shelter and interviews with families who'd made the transition from log cabins to earth-sheltered homes. One quote from Margaret Hensley captured the broader lesson. "We came west thinking we knew better than the old ways. We built what looked modern and proper, and we nearly froze to death for our arrogance." Jacob taught us that primitive doesn't mean inferior. Sometimes it means proven. The journalist asked Jacob if he felt vindicated by the recognition. Vindicated? Jacob considered the word. "No, I feel relieved. For 3 generations, my family built with stone and earth in Germany. These techniques kept people alive through wars, through plagues, through winters that lasted 5 months. I simply trusted what I was taught. The validation isn't that I was right. The validation is that the knowledge, thousands of years of human experience, was right." He paused, then added, "The danger is thinking that because something is old, it is obsolete. Often, the opposite is true. Old means tested. Old means it survived when other ideas failed." By 1892, approximately 34 earth-sheltered homes had been built within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook. They represented perhaps 15% of the structures in the region, a significant minority. Not everyone converted. Some genuinely preferred conventional homes despite the costs. Others lacked the skill or resources for earth-shelter construction. But the principle had been proven, documented, and disseminated. The knowledge was no longer fragile, held in one man's hands. Jacob Reinhardt lived in his original dugout until 1903, when he built a larger earth-sheltered home to accommodate his new wife and her 2 children. The original structure still stood in 1920, according to county records. Its stone vault, the impossible roof that would certainly collapse, remained structurally sound after 35 years. Modern earth-shelter architecture owes much to pioneers like Jacob, though few contemporary designers know his name. The principles he demonstrated, thermal mass, earth insulation, passive temperature regulation, have been validated by decades of engineering research. Studies confirm what Jacob knew intuitively. Earth-sheltered homes in cold climates can reduce heating costs by 60 to 80% compared to conventional construction. The technology has evolved. We now have vapor barriers, modern insulation, concrete instead of stone. But the core wisdom remains unchanged. Work with the Earth's natural properties rather than fighting against them. Store heat in mass. Minimize the temperature differentials you must overcome. Design for the climate you have, not the climate you wish you had. Jacob Reinhardt's legacy isn't just in the structures he built or the families he taught. It's in a larger lesson his shelter demonstrated during that January killing cold in 1886. Dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not the ignorance of our ancestors, but our own. They laughed at the buried shelter with the stone roof. They called a grave a folly, an immigrant's fantasy. Then temperatures plunged to 30 below zero, and everyone else was burning through their wood supply in a panic struggle for survival, while Jacob sat comfortably with a handful of embers, wrapped in the thermal embrace of centuries-old engineering wisdom. The prairie wind still howls across Dakota Territory every winter. But in those scattered, earth-sheltered homes, the descendants of Jacob's original design, families stay warm with a fraction of the resources, protected by the very earth beneath their feet. Sometimes the most advanced technology is simply remembering what we never should have forgotten. Before you go, if this story changed how you think about building, heating, or traditional knowledge, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what traditional technique or old wisdom you think we should revisit in modern times. And if you want to see more stories about frontier engineering and survival techniques that actually worked, let me know in the comments. There are dozens more stories like this waiting to be told. Stay warm out there. And remember, sometimes digging down is the smartest way to rise above.